We are so glad that you can join us tonight, John.
No problem. It's great to be here.
And I'm sure you have a very busy schedule, so thank you for fitting us in. But also, thank you for being willing to talk about your faith and other things, because it's a big thing, and we're really excited about that. So again, can we just welcome John? Well, why don't we start at the beginning?
Sure.
John has been the MP for Salisbury in Wiltshire since 2010.
Yes.
And you are the Parliamentary Private Secretary to the Opposition.
To Kemi Badenoch, the leader of the Opposition.
To Kemi.
Yeah.
And you've held a number of positions in government in the last decade. But how did we get here? Have you always wanted to be a politician?
Well, no, I didn't want to be a politician when I was up until the age of 11. So that was... I grew up in a really wonderful, loving home in North Wiltshire, so between Bath and Swindon. And my father had a glasshouse nursery, so he grew pot plants. My mother was a hairdresser. And they, had a very straightforward life, me and my younger sister, Camilla. And, wonderful parents. I wouldn't say, my mum would probably be a bit upset, but wouldn't say it wasn't a Christian home, as I came to find out later. And my dad really didn't want me to go into the business because, hard work, 100 degrees in the nursery, there's only 6 or 7 people there. It was a small business. And when I was 11, he took me up to the House of Commons. And I just had sort of like a light bulb moment. I thought, well, this is just amazing. Just the surroundings. But I grasped that the people there were responsible for our laws and also for representing people. And all then through the rest of my secondary school, when people said, well, what do you want to do when you grow up? I said I wanted to be an MP. I probably at the time said I wanted to be Prime Minister, but I've given up on that one, and very happy to be an MP. And then, so I did all the sort of things you'd expect, and sort of person who wanted to be head boy at age 13, and I was. And then I wanted to go to Oxford to do history, and didn't get in, reapplied, got in. And then, really, I had an awakening as a Christian through my time at university. I went to the smallest, least well-known college in Oxford called Mansfield, and I was thrilled to have the opportunity to go there. And I was dating a girl in my final year. I was JCR president, and she said, well, you're not a Christian. I said, well, of course I am. I go to church so many times a year, and Christian values. And there's a mission, and it was literally 30 years ago this month. So it was 1996, the penultimate term of my time at Oxford. And there was a visiting preacher from Australia called John Chapman. I think he's known as Chapo. And he just gave a very clear explanation of what Jesus did for us all on the cross and invited us to make a response to that. And, I was sat at the back of the church in St. Ebbs in Oxford, and I made a commitment in my heart at that point. And then what happened after that was quite extraordinary, really, because the next day, I was in the Porter's Lodge of the college, such that it was, and I told my wife I'd become a Christian. And this friend of mine who was in the year below me, he was the chair of the Oxford Labour Club. And obviously, I wasn't that way inclined. But he said his co-chair was at another college at St. John's, and his godmother was a woman who worked for CARE, the Christian charity CARE, and Anna Holt, I think Care for Education. And they had this internship program where they placed young Christians with MPs of all parties 4 days a week, and then a day you work together. You'd come together and have theological training and preparing for life. So I wrote off in those days. Email was just about starting. And of course, I went for an interview with Charlie Colchester and Lyndon Bowring at CARE. And I remember saying, look, if you want somebody who's totally sorted on Christianity, then don't have me. But, I've been passionate about politics since the age of 11. And I had a job lined up with a management consulting firm, which, I then deferred. And they placed me, took me on. And with about 8 others, we did the care program that year. And that was 96-7. And I, two wonderful Christian men, Gary Streeter, who retired from Parliament. He was one of the few on my side who actually retired of his own choice 2 years ago. And Michael Bates, who's now in the House of Lords. And they've been close friends since. And that was my care year. And so that was the start of my journey into politics. I then started my job at Anderson Consulting that became Accenture. And again, on the first day, I met a committed Christian, a man called Mark Spellman, whose wife had just been elected a member of Parliament in the Midlands, Caroline Spellman, who went on and was a cabinet minister. And we formed a Christian fellowship at that firm. And then about 3 years later, I was doing projects and so on, different firms. He rang me up and he said, there's an opportunity to work for William Hague for 6 months on secondment. So I thought, I can't believe this. I'm going to be paid by Anderson Consulting, very good salary, to work for 6 months preparing William Hague for Prime Minister's Question Time and briefing people to go on any questions or question time. And so that's what I did. And I also stood in Plymouth, Devonport as my sort of no-hoper. I never had one thought that I was going to win. It was a Labour majority of 19,000. And it was still a Labour majority, but 13,000 at the end of it. And then I came here in 2002-03. I was getting a bit disillusioned, still wanting to be an MP. And I did an MBA at the Judge, and I was at Fitzwilliam here for a year. I think I came to this church a little bit in the midweek Bible study. And then I went back and had the opportunity, probably because of that experience, to be Deputy Director and Director of Research for the Conservative Party. And then subsequently, 2010, it's a whole nother story, but I shall stop in a moment, otherwise it'll get a bit boring. I was selected on the 31st of January 2010 in an open primary, actually, in Salisbury Playhouse. There was 450 people there. And then that was the start of my journey then. 3 months later, I was elected, and I've been an MP since.
Tell us some of the key roles that you've held, just so we have an idea in the room of as we go through.
Well, I think the first thing I'd say about being a member of Parliament is that it's a role of two halves. What you do in the constituency is you're an advocate for all of those 72,000 people. And people come to you with a surgery on a Friday, and you meet with them. You try and get to the bottom of their problem. And often their assessment of what you can do is way different to what you can do. But you do whatever you can. And we get a budget, each of us, of about, enough to employ 5 people. And they help us. And, you're chairing meetings, you're attending civic functions, you're trying to make good things happen. You're trying to, get investment in the city, you're trying to support charities, give encouragement to people. So it's quite pastoral in some ways. And I think you've got to want to do that. And then, of course, the other half is trying to make a contribution to run the country or oppose who's running the country. A constituted role that, I have an obligation to do. And so the first 2 years I was on the Defence Select Committee, and then I spent 5 years, which is a rather long time, being a parliamentary private secretary, which my stepson used to call personally picked slave, which is sort of right. The idea is you're a bag carrier and you the eyes and ears to the 3 cabinet ministers. So I worked for Eric Pickles in local government for 3 years, and then Sajid Javid in business secretary, and then Philip Hammond when he was Chancellor. Then after the 2017 election, where my party nearly lost the majority from a position of being 20 points up, that was a great moment, I was appointed to be a minister, Arts, Heritage and Tourism. I did that for 6 months. And then in January 2018, there was a reshuffle. This can happen all the time. And our system's so bizarre. There's not like technical job of sort of mixing someone's skills with the job, I moved to the Treasury, and I became Economic Secretary to the Treasury, which is financial services. And amazingly, I did that job for 4.5 years because they just wouldn't promote me. So anyway, I love that job, and that's where I probably got, made my, if I did have a name in any meaningful sense, that was probably what I was known for. And then I resigned. I just couldn't deal with Boris Johnson anymore. And then Liz Truss, I wasn't with her, I was with Rishi. And then Rishi became Prime Minister, and he made me Chief Secretary to the Treasury. And then there's a final twist to it, because in the autumn of 23, I thought I'd been tipped to be Defence Secretary. That didn't happen in the August. Grant Shapps became Defence Secretary. And then Rishi had me in after he'd sacked Suella Braverman. What happened to her? Oh, yeah. I was offered an honour to leave government, or I was given the opportunity to move to become Paymaster General. And for the last 6 months, I did all the work to get the legislation through on the infected blood compensation scheme, which had been a national scandal for 40, 50 years. And it was my privilege the day before the election to get the legislation through, which paved the way for people who, haemophiliacs, to be compensated for the blood products. And then I took a year out and I did a visiting fellowship at St Anthony's College, Oxford. It was just with a Labour MP, Liam Byrne. And I joined the Treasury Select Committee. And then last summer, Kemi rang me up, and I was in a care home in Salisbury. And she said, would I become her parliamentary private secretary? Which is a bit of an unconventional step, because most people would have thought, well, I should be in the shadow cabinet. But I thought this was what she'd asked me to do. And we get on extremely well. And so for the last 6 months, I've been helping her. I should be helping her think about PMQs. I should be going back tonight. I should be in there tomorrow at 8 o'clock. And just supporting her, really. And obviously, through recent weeks, getting alongside colleagues, trying to persuade them that it's not a good idea to defect. And just having being a supportive person around her. And obviously, having been around for a while, and hopefully I can add some value.
Sounds like it's a really, really varied job.
Yeah.
What do you most enjoy about your job? And what, looking back, have been some of the highlights for you, where you've just been proudest of, or you feel you've made a real impact?
Well, I think I'm just really conscious of the responsibility of being an MP. I live in a little rented flat right in the Cathedral Close in Salisbury. And so whenever I step outside my front door, people recognise me, and I just feel that responsibility to, be there for people, really, and I love that responsibility. I think there's lots of little things that I've been able to help with my team to deliver things for people. There's a lady who came to me distraught. She'd gone through a divorce. She'd needed to sort out her finances, and she'd said to the judge, as they were about to settle the division of a forces pension, don't we need this adjusted because I'm going to have to take it early? And they said, no. And then, of course, sure enough, 3 months after, they reduced her income by about 30 to 40%. And I thought, well, this just isn't right. And so I had 3 adjournment debates in the House of Commons, and I persuaded the minister to take a decision to overrule. And I've just become a trustee of a homeless charity in Salisbury, and she's a volunteer there. And every time I see her, like tears come in my eyes, because I just think your retirement is different because of, the way our office was able to help. So there's little things like that. But I think probably the infected blood compensation scheme would be the most significant thing I would have done on a national basis. And that was very delicate. I had to go around the whole country and look people in the eye and say, on behalf of the British state, I'm sorry. And some of these people's lives have been completely ruined. They had HIV, they'd lost relatives. So, that brought it home to me, what a privilege it is to do the job. But actually, you've just got to keep going. I mean, I'm 52 this year. I was re-elected 2 years ago, and, I think I've got, some more years in me, and we'll see if the people of Salisbury think so.
John, maybe we zoom out a little bit and think a bit about the role of an MP. And if I would ask you, what do you think the purpose and the role of government is? I wonder what you'd hazard as an answer. And do you think your Christian faith means that you see that differently? Maybe just, if you talk to your colleagues, do you think you have a distinct angle on that, or where?
Well, it's very difficult because I think obviously I've been through a few cycles now, several elections, and probably my perspectives has changed. Probably if you asked me this question 15, 16 years ago, I was like, well, I want to be a minister. I want to do, now I've had some experience of that. I've attended cabinet, and probably I'm older, and now I think, I'm not in that same place. But I really, the first role of government is to essentially steward the resources that we as taxpayers give to government to, provide services and order those services. I mean, as a basic principle, as a Christian, what I want is a society where we as believers are able to worship freely, which isn't actually as straightforward as in the last generation as one would have hoped. But actually, we are organised through political parties in our system to, steward resources, to deliver services, and to protect our country, to look after the vulnerable, and to be represent our national interest on the world stage at a time where there's lots of disputes over how to do that. But but I'd go back to the constituency role. Most of my colleagues, 650 of us from all parties, pursue a similar rhythm to life. They probably spend 3 or 4 days in the constituency doing surgeries, pretty unglamorous work, but trying to make good things happen. So, as a Christian, I think I see it as an opportunity to serve. I think if I wasn't a Christian, I'm not quite sure where ambition would fit into it. Whereas I think as a Christian, I see I'm here to serve. Lord, use me as you wish. And I think probably it's been quite interesting for some of my colleagues who come up to me and saying, well, we were in the cabinet together. What are you doing being Kemi's PPS? Shouldn't you? It's a bit demeaning, isn't it? And I said, no, I'm here to serve, And so in a way, it's a way of me expressing my Christian motives, which are perhaps different to a sort of worldly, somebody who's determined to get to the top. And I had the sensation when I sat in the cabinet for the first time, and I thought, wow, my father died very young. He had an industrial illness from the nursery. And I thought, gosh, I wish I could have spoken to him. And as I looked around the cabinet room, and I thought, is this it? Because I'd spent all that time since the age of 11 wanting to get there. But it's made me think a lot about the Christian life and what's really important. And it's about how we are, how I relate to people, rather than what position I hold or what piece of legislation I pass. Because in the end, we are on this planet for a blip in eternity, as I like to say. That is true. And if we believe what's in the Bible, then we should live life truly, meaningfully in the context of that. Now, we might struggle, and some of my colleagues, Christian friends in Parliament, would struggle with the sort of, well, what's the right place for ambition? Because they're ambitious to use their talents. In Matthew 25, you think about the talents. They're not to be buried. They're to be used. But having humility about, I'm not going to be Prime Minister, right? I'm pretty clear about that. Kemi is. But the point is, how do you manage that? That's a tension. You can be open to where God's prepared to use you and take you. But at the same time, it's him, not my will be done. And that's quite hard to get that right. How do I use my time? I've got Joel with me today. Joel is a care graduate, the scheme I did 30 years ago. And, we plan the week, and there's so many things I can do, and managing my time. Yesterday I got into Parliament at 11. And between 11 and 2:30, I had 7 meetings, didn't I? One after another, for different things. Meeting the chief whip, meeting somebody from a financial institution, one-to-one with the producer of Question Time, trying to persuade me after all these years that I should go on Question Time. I don't mind any questions, but Question Time is pretty intense. So there's always something to do. But I've recognised that the perception of politicians and Christians in politics is, there's quite a range of views. And I go to St. Paul's Church in Salisbury, and they're very, very supportive, and they pray for me, and it's very humbling. But I think one of the things I would say is that people often don't quite get that, we wouldn't start from where we are now. If you look at society, obviously. But I find myself a member of Parliament in this season of history. And, for example, gay marriage came up in my first term. That wasn't in our manifesto. It's now something that, as world's moved on. And, but these are really difficult issues to grapple with as a Christian.
Can I jump in on some of those?
Of course.
So a couple of questions maybe. And I think these were relevant for many of us in different roles, not just politics, but how do you get the balance between representing those who have elected you out of the country and leading?
Well, I don't think I was elected to then, on every vote, try and work out what the balance of opinion is. I was elected to make decisions. And, of course, I've got to be accountable for the decisions I take. But there are 72,000 people in all, typically in a constituency, plus or minus 5%. About 60 to 70% of them vote. And in my case, 34% of those who voted. So, I'm not there just obviously to represent the people who voted for me. I'm there to say, well, what is the right thing to do given all that I can see? And sometimes that takes me to places where I think probably the majority don't, and they will say so. And they'll have the opportunity to vote me out at the next election. But I can't be going around saying, let's have a Twitter poll or something. Because, but some colleagues do take that approach. Yeah. It's not because I'm arrogantly saying I know best, but I just think the model is that you're elected to make those judgments, and that's what people put their faith in me.
And what about when that causes tension within the party? Maybe you wouldn't, agree with the whip or the line. Has that been a situation you've been in? How does that play out in practice?
Well, very few issues are. When we were in government, we had a manifesto, and we still have a manifesto, but obviously we lost, so it's a bit different. So we've got to take a judgment over how we oppose the government. And sometimes that's quite delicate in opposition. But in government, I can't be part of a party, get elected with my party label, and then say, well, actually, I'm going to do all things differently. Now, some people Christians who aren't supporters of my party, would say, why can't you just be independent and I'll be able to vote for you? And I said, well, because if I did, there'd be a few thousand Christians who might be inclined to vote for me. But in the end, most people don't know. They vote on who they want to be Prime Minister, and they vote on different things, not on knowing me, because I can't be known that intimately by everyone. So, I suppose I find it sort of... I've never had too many conflicts. The gay marriage, the assisted dying, I was against. I voted against gay marriage, and I voted against assisted dying. They were conscience issues where we had a free vote. I did have an interesting one today where we had a debate on the two-child policy, two-child cap on benefits, which the government have removed. Because I'm on the Treasury Select Committee, which means it's a cross-party, Select Committees are a cross-party group of 11 MPs, drawn proportionately from the strength of Parliament. So there's 11 of us, 2 Conservative, 2 Liberal Democrat, and 7 Labour. And we heard evidence that said, well, from academics saying that the two-child cap was in place, but there was no evidence that it was having a behavioural effect. But that said, you're stewards of resources. It's going to cost £3 billion to remove it. And these are really delicate judgments. I'm thinking, well, these children didn't, they didn't ask to have parents who brought them into the world. What's the balance against that versus the signalling to society? So sometimes these issues are complicated, and your conscience has obviously got to play a role in that. But equally, if you just thought I've had to join a team, and there are bits of life that sometimes you have to just go along with. I think if it was things in the I have got a sort of conscience constituency party in that order. So I've got to live with myself, and then I've got to represent the people that put me there, and then my party. But then I wouldn't have joined the party if I didn't have a broad support for it. But of course, government, things like when we had the Syrian, when we took action in Syria, what are you going to do? There's no manifesto on that, and that's when you have got to that. So sometimes like that, it's been really, really felt responsibility.
How do you personally? I'm sure many of us have had the experience of having big decisions flying at us faster than we can sit down and kind of work. There must be a lot of things coming at you as an NP, as part of the party, in your different roles. How do you deal with the volume of decisions?
I think you become more confident over time, and you learn how to sort of prioritize, how to manage, like all of us, all of you in your different works, roles in life. I think probably time has taught me to, trust that actually not everything depends on my judgment and what I do. That I am, part of a system. I am a cog in a machine, but I'm also, a Christian who can trust that God has put me there for a purpose. Frankly, there are times where I've thought, gosh, it would have been much easier, particularly what we've gone through as a party in opposition the last 18 months, to think, well, gosh, it would have been easier to walk off and do another role. But actually, I feel called to it, and I felt that the fact I was, given an opportunity to do another term, I've got to make the best of that. And I think every day is about salvaging what you can. But I say to people when I go into schools, I say, try and find something where you're not looking at your watch. And I never really look at my watch. I enjoy what I do, and I'm very conscious of the privilege it is. So no job is perfect. And, obviously being in our national parliament. I mean, I had a wonderful incident the other day, sorry to digress, but somebody came up to me at church, and they said for 20 years, they've been going to Winchester Prison as part of the, what was it, Joel? Prison Fellowship. But there was this particular program, Sycamore Tree. Thanks. Sycamore Tree. And basically, they work with convicted criminals and say to them, come to terms with what you've done. And let's meet the victim. And apparently, the officials in the Ministry of Justice, I assume, said, well, it's only had a 24% success rate, so we're going to stop it. And this was on Sunday at church. And on the Thursday, I actually mentioned it on the floor of the house and got a letter from the, we got some follow-up. And then they just realized that you are actually making a difference. And then they asked me to put something in their magazine or something. So that's when you realize there's so many things you can do. And you also see it with international work. When I've worked in Uganda and doing the manifesto for the opposition party 20 years ago, you think, gosh, you just realize how privileged we are. And then I was sat next to a gentleman at church who just every time I think about him and his wife, they're teachers, they're in their late 50s. 10 years ago, they brought their family up and they decided they needed to go to Africa. I think it was Kenya. And they brought back 2 children, which they adopted. They were like 2, both of them 2. They weren't siblings. And now they're getting to the late stage of their career and, they're tired and they're bringing these children up. They're now like 12 or 11 or 12. And he said to me, he said, people make so many complaints in this country about this not working, that not working. He says, gosh, when we were in Africa for a year, we'd have been so grateful to have what we have here. And I do feel sometimes that, Christians, my Christian sort of anchors at church can really help me get perspective when sometimes each morning I look at the news and I think, gosh, it's just so depressing. Where do you start? Am I going to make any difference? But equally, I worked for Philip Hammond, and, when he got to the end of his career and he retired and didn't stand in 2019, he, said to me, did I make much of a difference? What? And I think that was, again, quite leveling in the sense of, from the outside, you think, these people become cabinet ministers and do whatever, but we're all just trying to salvage what we can. And that, for me as a Christian, helps me put it in perspective. Not that I'm not eager to do loads of things and make a contribution and respond to what people ask me to do, but I think my faith gives me perspective on what success looks like.
Well, I'd love to ask you how you sustain your faith, because, you're traveling back and forth, busy job, lots going on. Over the years, what has sustained you? Do you have any rhythms, personal life rules?
Well, I very much attend my church in Salisbury. I can't go to midweek groups because I'm in London. Most of the time I've been in Parliament, I've gone to a Bible study on Wednesday mornings. But I'm in a different season at the moment because since I've become Kemi's PPS, Wednesday morning is PMQ prep. So I don't go to it at the moment. I think maintaining a network of Christian friends is really important because I do lean into people who I've known for 30 years and consciously spend time with them. The pastor of my church in Salisbury is a really good friend to pray with and to meet up with regularly. So that's basically it. There's no magic to it. There are a number of Christian fellowship groups in Parliament, and I could be going to a fellowship group every morning if I wanted to, but that's not realistic. But we all are aware of different Christians in Parliament, across party, and we encourage each other and support each other. Tim Farron's a friend of mine, a number of Stephen Timms as well, and so we in the Labour Party. So we all know what we've got to do. We all know we've got different paths at different seasons. When Stephen wanted to be chairman of the DWP Select Committee, I was the first person to, support him and try and get my colleagues to support him as well, for example. So there is a fellowship that goes beyond party. But I think one of the things probably I would say is, from the outside looking in, people probably think, well, can't you Christians get together and sort this country out? and I was sat there on the back benches quietly feeling I didn't need to vote in this thing today because I was coming here. So I was what we call slipped. And I was looking over at Stephen Timms, and I just thought, we're on different sides of this. And my friend Gary Streeter had a prayer fellowship for many years with 5 MPs from different parties. And on the when we had the vote in the noughties on, I wasn't there then, obviously, on civil partnerships and age of consent things, they were all on a completely different page. I think where I find it difficult is in things like assisted dying, which for me I just feel very strongly about. And that was a very upsetting time when I walked out of the chamber and there was a Labour minister who was in my Bible study and she touched me and I was tears in my, that's when you feel the power of Parliament. We made a decision. It's obviously still not come to a conclusion, as you'll probably know. It's in the House of Lords. You felt the collective power in the room that day. I still find it, an intimidating place. And I think if I lost that respect for the chamber, then that wouldn't be a good thing. But a lot goes on in there.
And you've been very open about your faith, as you were here tonight, sharing with us. And
well, why not?
Why not? What would you say? I'm sure there's many of us who would like to be more open about our faith, and maybe we're in public-facing roles, where we are visible and we're representing others. And what would your advice be for to navigate that well?
Well, I think what I'd say is, we go this way but once, and if we don't, we know in our hearts what our faith brings to our life and our perspective on life. It gives a degree of certainty, a degree of hope, a degree of purpose, a degree of perspective. And in the end, it's pretty fundamental. When John Chapman said to me, well, who's Jesus? What did he do on the cross for you? Well, you can't half commit to an answer to that question. And if he is, which I obviously believe he is, and many of you will, and that what he did on the cross for us is transformational potentially for you and everyone, then, we have an opportunity to present that howsoever is appropriate and the best. And sometimes it might be praying quietly for a work colleague. For some, it might be saying, come along to an Alpha course. For some, it might be just befriending them in their life's trials and not judging them and being there for them to communicate something distinct that comes from Christ's love for us. And so I don't see it as any different as if I was a nurseryman like my late father. I've got a responsibility to live out my faith, and for me, it's obviously in the public square. But there is wisdom in how to do that, and we live in a contested space as well. And you've got to be able to account for why you believe what you believe. But I think probably over the years I've become a little bit more understanding and forgiving towards the range of expressions within the Christian family.
Yeah.
Whereas I think I was went from St. Ebbs to St. Helens Bishopsgate, and then I went to a plant of St. Helens Bishopsgate, for those of you who know in the city, and it was very prescriptive. And I think, I always say, and I will say it to William Taylor next time I see him, and I haven't seen him for several years, and he was it was either you go into the church or you become a teacher at a UN school, and there isn't much else. And I don't believe that's true either. We need people who are tech entrepreneurs who are going to make lots of money and do some good with that money. We need people who are going to schools, of course we do, but we need people in the health service to lead complexity in a pretty difficult environment where demand is high, resources are low, and there's a leadership role there. So this is the path that I've been given from that day in 1985 when I went to House of Commons.
Do you think it's cost you, just looking at it career-wise, do you think being so public about your faith has held you out of positions or? Possibly.
I think voting against gay marriage didn't go down too well with David Cameron and the people around him, not so much him, but I mean, it's worked out fine. I get on very well with David Cameron, but I wasn't really that comfortable with David Cameron and George Osborne's sort of metropolitan liberal approach. They were within the same family, and I respect them. They have many qualities, but I wasn't really on the same page. But within all political parties, there's a range of views, and I've sort of accepted that. Obviously, there's got to be sufficient common view, but has it cost me? I don't know. I mean, there's plenty of people who don't start off wanting to be an MP. I've been an MP for 16 years, and I've been in government minister for 7, I think. So that's a great privilege. If the good people of Salisbury have had enough of me in 2028 or 29 or whenever it is, it'll be hard. But then I trust that God has got something else for me, and I'm sure I'll find something else to do.
I'm going to throw you a couple of bigger questions about kind of what we're facing as a country. We're hearing a lot about kind of Christian nationalism. We're seeing it come into our politics and into the news a lot. What is your take on that? The good, the bad, the things to think about.
Well, I'm very uncomfortable with it, and I'm thinking it through and praying about it, reading about it. I'm going to do a lecture at the end of the summer with the Conservative Christian Fellowship, which is a fellowship in the Conservative Party that was founded by my good friend, still good friend, even though he's defected to another party. It's Tim Montgomery and David Burrows. And I'm doing that lecture at the beginning of September. And I think what it's done is it's, for me, tried to sort of appropriate Christianity for a sort of secular purpose, born of a deep frustration of liberal culture and institutions. But for me, the heart of being a Christian in politics is about being a disciple of Jesus and trying to be godly in my manner and my approach to everything I do. That does mean I have clear views about the failures of different institutions. And I do, and that's a sort of technical issue around what I think the prospectus should be for my party for government at the next time. But the notion that somehow Christianity, or that there should be a fusion of national identity and following Christ, I find difficult to. I think it's quite a narrow stream of theological that born of theology has its origins in a sort of an Americanized view, which I don't find compelling. But I mean, I try and be respectful of all parties. I mean, Danny Kruger is a good friend of mine. I've known him 25 years. He's my neighbouring MP, and I was sad when he, defected to Reform. And but there's a lot of complexity which I won't go into around why he might have done that. And but one has got to be respectful of your colleagues and trust God with the outcome. But I'm not comfortable with it, and as I say, I feel that it feels to me a perversion of what being a follower of Jesus is about. And I think it's linked to a critique of society, which I don't necessarily disagree with, but I don't think you find the solution in that way.
And is this my chance to ask you about Reform then? Do you think that's linked? Why do you think, I mean, there's certainly, a swell and a lot of seeming momentum and being talked about, and it's sort of come out of nowhere. What's your take on why that's happening? What's behind that?
Well, I think the truth is, it is an expression of frustration of the failure of my government and the failure very quickly afterwards of the new government in the eyes of those who support. And it's you're all useless, so let's go with something new. We're not at the stage at this point, probably 3 years from a general election, of properly scrutinising what the full platform for government is. But it's quite a compelling, superficial message, which is everyone else has failed, we need something new. But then when you begin to scrutinise it, and I don't want to get too much into policy because it's sort of a bit indecent in the church probably. But in essence, I have grave misgivings about the coherence of what then was a prescription for government. I think there's a lot of people there who have hunger to change things, but probably have grown short of patience of how challenging it is. And the challenge of all government is to manage business as usual whilst also deliver change. And that is quite difficult for those of you who work in any field. That's really hard. How do you do that when you've got limited resources? And I think what I've seen is that, and we see it with President Trump, we see that people are frustrated, so they look for seductive communicators who offer words which, not all wrong, but actually when you then come to examine what that leads to, it's not a compelling solution. So, and it's a long way to go until the next election. And this is, we'll see how things play out. But also personal ambition is a factor for some people who want to, can see which way it's going. And that, I think, is very difficult for me as a Christian, because I sort of think, well, you'll get there, maybe. But what's the having a position is not really what it's about.
Yeah.
But let's be honest. What I think my quick analysis of the last generation is that post 97 we had a Labour government that had inherited golden economic legacy. That was what Tony Blair's economic advisor said. They expanded the size of the state, got involved in more aspects of our lives, some good, but post-2008, the trajectory of growth in the economy has not been high enough to sustain that. Brexit, whether you agree with it or not, was disruptive. And COVID was enormously damaging to our culture and our sort of freedom, and also the way our public services worked, the way that we didn't get back into work, but also to our public finances. And the catastrophic presentational handling and behaviours of some people in government fused with that. But the bit that isn't often spoken about is the deterioration in the growth trajectory, which doesn't give us the choices, yet we've still got expectations. The disruptive effect. Brexit meant different things for different people, and it was unlikely to satisfy all of the different motivations for supporting it. And COVID was a disaster at many levels. Those three things, for me, are quite fundamental to where we are now. But we've also, at the same time, over my time in politics, I think I had Twitter in 2010, but social media, Joel would probably take a picture of me or something, and we'll have to work out which platform to put it on. Yeah. It's constant. And, that, and it leads people to not be interested in a grown-up conversation about policy and the trade-offs. And I think that is regrettable, because it means that the complexity of government can't be properly explained, because everything gets... I was a lovely Christian friend of mine, Chris Mould. He used to run the Trussell Trust food banks, founded in Salisbury, as was Help for Heroes. And Chris Mould, I was with him on Sunday, and we were talking about various things. And I said, I just want to... He voted Labour. He didn't vote for me. And I was really hard, because we go to church together. It was really hard. And he came around for dinner in the summer of 24, and he said, I just couldn't stand it. That last day, when you came down the road and you had these leaflets saying, Labour are going to put up your taxes, I just thought, I cannot have this. It's nothing we said in the manifesto. And he said, I just want to gently, in a, brotherly way, say to you, Chris, you remember that leaflet? He says, you were right. I said, that's all I want. That's all I want. And he says, I'm too idealistic. I said, well, we've got something that binds us together. But, it's not, sorry, I'm waffling on.
Great.
Yeah.
Last couple of things, because I'd love to get some questions from the audience. But there will be people here who might be considering going into politics, or maybe should be considering going into politics. Why do we need Christian MPs? What would you say to someone who's thinking about it or should be thinking about it?
Well, I think you need to feel a sense of calling and a sense of conviction. It's not a job. It's a bit like what you do. You feel called to it because it's with you all the time. You don't really, turn off from it. But it's really important because hopefully, as Christians here this evening, we believe that we have the fundamental answers to the meaning of life. And if you can apply that spirit and to the running of the country and be a participant in that, then it's probably for the good. It doesn't mean to say Christians have a monopoly on getting everything right. Of course we don't. But the more Christians there are together, working together, allows God to work through them for the good of our country. And that could be at parish level. It could be at a council level. It could be as a civil servant. There's loads of ways to do it, or do what I do, which is, be sort of the public face of government or opposition. But, I'd say think carefully about it. Ask your closest friends and those who really know you and you trust. Is this, and weigh it up. Perhaps do apply for the internship that I did. And
that was care.
Care.
And
yeah.
what are some good first steps? So there's care.
So there's care. There's a website, Work for an MP, and sometimes there are sort of opportunities. You might write to your own MP and say, well, I'm thinking, could I come and do some work experience? I'm now doing a week's work experience for young people in Salisbury in the summer, where I'm trying to really expose them to the whole thing of the constituency and London. Weigh it up. It took me 25 years from that time when I went into the House of Commons as an 11-year-old before I made it. And it was obviously meant to be. But I've had several Christian friends who have not gone down that, and they spent a long, long time desperately trying to do it. Be honest about what your motivations are. If it's to be on the telly, then it's probably not right. Because it's not a job for everyone, and I don't, it's a lot of personal sacrifice. I was married, I'm not married anymore. My ex-wife he was a Christian, but found it very, very difficult and to be involved in it, and didn't like the scrutiny and so on. So I would be very cautious for all of you, further on, if, just make sure you've got complete alignment, because it's a pretty unforgiving life, but one I would not change.
And John, finally, how can we be praying for our political system and for Christian politicians?
Well, I wish there was more consensus in politics. I find the constant frictions really difficult, but sort of inevitable, because in the end we're contesting the ideas to run the country. But I think it would be good to pray for, look, what we need more than anything is we need a revival in this country. We need more people to turn to Christ to get the right perspective on life. And from that, everything else flows. And, it's been heartening to hear from vicars in my constituency and from some of the work done from some of the think tanks about the interest of young people going to church, and you'd know a lot about this. But I suppose I would just say, we should be praying for revival, but we should also be praying for those that are in politics to continue to be motivated to keep going. There's a colleague tonight who I'm told is thinking of quitting, possibly before an election, because it's just so draining. And so, pray for those Christians, and for Christians across different parties, that we can find common cause and actually be in it for the right motivations rather than the pursuit of power, the pursuit of good government.
John, thank you. We're going to have Q&A in a moment, but can we just start by saying thank you to John? We really, really appreciate Thank you, John. We're going to take just a moment. There's going to be a QR code on the screen. So if you have a phone, you want to QR code that, you can submit a question, and then they'll all come in a nice, good order, and we'll be able to have a look at them. So we're just going to take 2 minutes of a break, and then we'll come back and have a few questions. We won't have loads of time, but we'll have an opportunity. Thanks, John. Okay, we've got a few questions coming in. We'll just go from the top here. How do you think, like, the public, your experience of the public has changed over the last 16 years? How politicians engage with the public, but also kind of the feel of them engaging with you as a politician. Have you seen change in the last 15, 16 years?
Well, I think the major thing, as I touched on earlier, is the way that social media is where people interact or expect you to interact. We get vast numbers of emails. I think that was probably quite true back.
How many emails do you get?
I don't know. Varies quite a lot. Hundreds each. Yeah, hundreds daily. I mean, some of them are obviously superfluous, but I mean, some of them are really important. People crying out. I think people are very short of patience with politicians. I see people's eyes glaze over. I see people, even sometimes in church, sort of smile at me as if to say, oh, well, that sort of thing. And it's a bit sad. But then there are also people who, do cherish the office of the MP and, come to you and are very grateful when you can do things. But I think probably overall, I would say people are less, well, they're frustrated. They've seen behaviours from their leaders which have deeply offended and disappointed them. If I didn't, but if I'd have had parents or grandparents in a care home who died through COVID, and I'd seen what some of our leaders were doing, apparently in number 10, I mean, I'd be upset and angry. And I mean, it's therefore understandable that flows on from that. Time and time again, you see behaviours which aren't really those that you would wish to see. People in it for themselves and not for the service. So I think I've seen a deterioration in respect for politicians.
Another great question in here. How do you discern God's calling, and what role is kind of listening to God come into your leadership, into making decisions?
Well, I think what I do is I just give my best and see what opportunities come. I felt very strongly I needed to put the constituency, well, I've always put the constituency first, but not take on a front bench role after the election. And I enjoyed doing these seminars with Liam Byrne, the Labour MP, good policy in the era of populism at St Anthony's. And I enjoyed the Treasury Select Committee, and I feel like I've got a role there to, as a former minister, to be sat next to Meg Hillier, who's the excellent chair. So I just believe, my time goes, and my rhythm on weekends and Fridays has been the same as it has been for 16 years. So it's just sometimes just being faithful. It's probably like, I've got a vicar friend in the constituency, and he's got this really small church, and he's really tough demographic, and he just keeps going, even though things are really tough. And I sometimes think it's a bit like that. But then, out of the blue, Kemi calls me up, and I find, as I'm walking into, as I will be tomorrow at 5 to 12, and I shall be offering words of encouragement, I found a new role for this season. And, there are times where I can use my experience to help facilitate good things happening from behind the scenes. And I think, I can see how God's using me at this point. But sometimes you think, gosh, I've had enough of this. So like we all do, like I'm sure all of you do at times, where discerning God's purpose through every choice you make in a career is only sometimes in retrospect that you see his guidance.
What would you say to kind of, how do you respond to the news each day with it increasingly being negative, anxiety-inducing? How do you respond to the news each day? What advice would you give to us?
Well, I find it frustrating, disappointing, anger-inducing. I throw my hands up in the air and think, gosh, this is such a mess. But what else do we have? We're 5th, 6th largest economy in the world. We're a mature democracy. This is what our life is. I've got to strive to make it better and make my contribution felt. But you've got to just keep at it, salvage what you can, and each day just try and add some more to the positive.
Where do you draw your hope from?
Well, I've also seen seasons. I mean, I remember I was in the Treasury during COVID when I was the person who was responsible with Chancellor Rishi Sunak at the time of getting bounce back loans going. And it was really difficult. We'd come out of the financial crisis. You couldn't make a loan if you were a bank because you had to do a forward look of cash flows. Well, you couldn't do a forward look of cash flows if the economy had been shut down. So I had to go to the CEOs of the banks with Rishi and say, well, can we have a fixed rate loan? And we had to make it available to everyone. It amuses me 4 or 5 years later, I'm sat in the House of Commons and everyone's saying to me, it's all the corruption of under your, I think it wasn't at the time. People were calling. So, I suppose I just sort of see seasons pass and smile to myself and say, well, I wonder what will come next. Because history doesn't repeat itself. And there are, things have gone. If you said to me the day before the referendum in 2016, what would happen in the 3.5 years until Boris Johnson won the general election on the 12th, 13th December 2019, those 3.5 years, we had a referendum that probably went, well, I didn't vote for Brexit, but went the way that perhaps was a bit of a surprise. We had another general election. We had, Theresa May been and gone, and we had Boris with a big majority. And then we were just about to go into so the 3.5. Now, if you think of that, where we were in that summer of 2016 to now, we're about that distance now from probably the next general election. Well, I anticipate that the world will look very, very different. I think where we are at the moment, though, with what's going on with Iran, with Ukraine, Russia, what's going on with China, and obviously, President Trump's distinct style of leadership.
That's what people say about me. Distinct style of leadership.
Well, not for the same reasons, I think. But, there is a lot going on. And, if you didn't have faith at this time, you would go mad, I think.
Well, someone has asked, how can the UK avoid polarization that we've seen in the US?
Well, that will be for the country to examine the options with increasing meaningful scrutiny, helped by the media over the next 3 years, and actually look at the prospectus for government and actually say, how realistic and honest is this? And, politics shouldn't be about just entertaining. Well, it shouldn't ever be about entertaining people, but it's become a bit like that. I often feel quite inadequate because I feel like I'm a bit of a technocrat and I'm not exciting and I'm not amusing. But, I just feel like it's a noble calling to go into politics and to be in government. And I probably come from a different era with that regard, but probably through, you've got to do that blend of communicating effectively with people and, drawing them in. And at the moment, I think we're in a season where having a compelling critique and knocking everything down and being amusing and is cherished too highly, when actually what we really need to do is say, look, what can we afford? What are our priorities? And how are we going to actually deliver this? And how realistic is it? That's the collective judgment we've got to make over the next 3 years.
Last couple of questions. Yeah. How do you trust that God has ordained government leaders and elected officials, even when you feel you can see the effects and it isn't aligned with necessarily what we know of God's will?
Well, I think we are to pray for our leaders, whoever they are. God can sometimes allows bad things to happen or what we perceive to be bad things to happen for his purposes. I think it's having a bit of humility about the passage of time and what we learn through difficult times. Mm. And in my life, I would say that when things have been very difficult, of course we don't like going through it, but afterwards we see that God held something back. And I mean, when I was trying to be an MP, I was desperate to be in Henley because Boris gave up to be the mayor of London. I was getting married that year in 2008. I thought it was the perfect seat. David Cameron came down and basically vetoed me, not for anything against me, but wanted somebody who was more local for longer. Devizes was the seat right next to where I grew up, and I was barred from the shortlist because they wanted to make sure somebody else got the seat. And now I look back and think Henley's not held by my party. Devizes, the boundaries changed, and I ended up in the perfect seat. But I didn't feel that at the time. Mm. And I think that's true with what sometimes goes on in, why doesn't God intervene? Mm. Why doesn't he intervene in that situation in the Sudan? Well, I mean, this is more of you're better qualified than I am because, but I mean, I look at it and say, well, why do you send, I expect from this church, people out to preach the gospel in places where, there's very little gospel being preached because, we trust in his purposes, even if it looks hopeless. Mm. And I think that is what we do as Christians because we do trust God with the world, and we are just, his instruments for whatever role we have. Mm. But, about the parable of the talents, whatever you've got, use it. Mm. I still don't feel I've got any talents, but I just keep doing what I'm asked to do. So if people ask me to come here or they ask me to do PPS or whatever it is, I just do it. And that's how I see, and that's how I look back and say, well, God used me in whatever he did. Mm. And if I was trying to plot my way back to power, why? Mm-hmm. Why? Yeah.
How about if I asked you, final question, what would you say to encourage us as a church? Sitting as a politician, sitting what you've seen, and if you could write an open letter to us as a church and encourage us, what would you say?
Well, I think I would say to you, well, first let's say thank you for inviting me, but I'd also want to say, just reflect, have perspective on politics. Realize that, we are, as politicians, we don't have all the answers, but most of us who are there are seeking to make a difference. And I would urge you all to engage as much as you can in politics. If it doesn't interest you so much, then you're obviously not going to be an MP. But, all of us have got a responsibility, I think, as Christians, to engage in the public square. We shouldn't be separating ourselves out from that. We can't just be, have our faith and the world around us and how it's run, say that's not of interest. Mm. It is. And it can't just be on assisted dying. Why not about what's happening in our education system? Mm. Are the right things coming out of ministers? This will affect your children, your grandchildren. So I would urge you all to perhaps reflect on what level of engagement you have and think about what gifts you have and how you can use them to influence the way our country's run in a good way. And I think more broadly, I'd say, I don't see being a politician as a superior job. I see it as just the one that I've been given. And so if you've got no interest in politics, but you're just a bit curious, then that's fine too. But use your faith to good effect and don't be shy about speaking about your faith because you don't know who's around you and who could be moved to do amazing things. And I would say, in the end, the privilege I have of being able to talk about my faith in public because of the public role I have is special. But we've all got that opportunity wherever we work and whatever we do. And I think that's what I would reinforce, which is probably something that you reinforce every week, I hope.
Indeed. John, we're so grateful, and you've spoken so openly, and it's been such a privilege, lots to reflect on. We're really grateful. Can we say a big thank you, final time? Really, really appreciate it.